Thank you for tuning in to The Political Soup, where you hear editorial about the issues of the day and political philosophy. Your hosts are Nick Alex, our progressive, Dana and Pugh, our conservative, Paul Laws, our classical liberal, and here is our moderator and your host, John Toll.
Hello and welcome back to the Political Soup podcast. I'm your moderator, John Toll, and beneath us we've got, let's see, what are the names again? Danon and Nick and Paul. We're missing a couple guys. Mitch is not going to make it here tonight. And hopefully we'll get some other guests on in the next couple weeks. But anyway, tonight's topic is it's going to be a couple different things. We're going to start talking about voter identification, all kinds of different stuff, voters' rights. And I'm actually going to throw it over to Nick, and he's going to start kind of the topic rolling. We're not going to do an article tonight. We're just going to kind of play this by ear a little bit, just based on debate conversations and things like that. So, Nick, why don't you kind of give us a little bit of an idea of how you want to discuss this?
Yeah, thanks, John. I think from my standpoint, I just wanted to get a discussion rolling around voter ID laws, voter rights. Where should we place someone's right to vote in the priority list of government guarantees? I just know that in a couple of weeks there are going to be a lot of people going to the polls and making a choice for not only president, but a number of different offices, both federal and state, local. So it becomes an important day, and exercising your right to vote, in my opinion, is probably the biggest right that we need to guarantee in order to have a functioning democracy. And there's been a lot of stories in the news about tougher voter ID laws. People need to have picture IDs to show up and vote. There's a concern about voter registration fraud, and that ultimately leads to concerns about fraud of actual voting, which there are two different issues: registration fraud and voter fraud. But I really wanted to have a kind of robust discussion and see if this is a topic that we can have some sort of agreement on regardless of the political spectrum, or if there's something that fundamental guaranteeing the right to vote.
All right, and you know what? I'm going to throw this to Paul first, because I know how you're going to start this off, and it might be a tad different than what Nick's thinking.
Well, actually, to be honest, I'm a little bit torn on this one. Unfortunately, there are issues with people voting who may not necessarily be able to, or may not necessarily lawfully be able to, rather, I guess.
Well, before we get
that is a reality.
Before we get to the ID part, I just want to talk about the right to vote in general, and your thoughts on whether you should vote.
Oh, well, that's pretty simple. I mean, honestly, I think that everyone should have the right, certainly, but I don't think everyone should vote. Everyone, everyone voting is far different from the government necessarily making a rule that says you can vote if whatever. But I guess my point is, we have a duty to be informed. It's not our civic duty to vote. It's our civic duty to be informed and then vote. But that's I think common sense.
All right, and Dana, what are your thoughts on that? We'll get back to the ID stuff in a sec. I'm talking about.
Pretty much in complete agreement with Paul. All the get out the vote drives around election time, around election day, and now more and more often with absentee ballots and all that, really kind of bug me, because if any person doesn't have the motivation to get out and vote on their own, I'm not really in favor of, especially the groups that, I don't know how to phrase it, provide extra incentives for people to get out and vote, I guess. But yeah, if anybody doesn't have the motivation to get out and vote on their own, then they probably shouldn't be voting.
Do you have any specific examples of extra motivation?
Yeah, that's why I paused. I was afraid you'd ask me that. I don't offhand. I do remember hearing stories in past elections that I'm drawing a blank. Maybe I can find something for you in the course of the show.
Okay, somebody hands out, popsicles or something after Halloween. They're trying to get rid of their candy.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard stories of whatever, grabbing homeless people off the street and buying them a pack of cigarettes to vote and this and that. I'm sure there's stories. I don't know if there's substantial.
But that would be illegal.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't know how often it occurs. I don't know if they're backed up by evidence or proof. But, I mean, that would be one example. I'll see if I can find you something a little more substantial.
Okay. It does sound a little bit like urban legend, but that's a good question. Is that illegal to, incentivize them to vote by saying, hey, look, you should go vote Mr. Bum on the street. And if the bum goes and votes and he's not, told what to vote, is that illegal?
I'm not sure that it is. Maybe Paul knows, but that kind of bothers me as well, especially, if you're not told who to vote, but there are certainly other ways to convince a person or to target specific groups of people who statistically will vote one way or the other. I noticed that in particular with the youth get out the vote drive, the MTV Rock the Vote and such. I mean, statistically, younger people will vote for Democrats, and so the big drive to get out the youth vote is going to help the Democrats. And I find it to be a little hollow when groups like MTV have these campaigns and say, "Oh, it's nonpartisan." Don't quite buy it.
Well, have a platform that appeals to young voters, and then you don't have to worry about that, right? It's not about nonpartisan. Just because their audience skews one way or another.
I don't think it's a difference in platform. I think it's a difference in worldviews.
Actually,
when you're younger, you lean left. As you get older, you lean right. It's just,
see, but I was the exact opposite. When I was younger, I leaned right, and now I lean left. So.
Oh, what happened to you, Nick?
I don't know. Got my polls reversed, apparently.
What were you going to say, Paul?
I don't even know.
Nick just blew your mind. Okay, good. All right, well, yeah, Nick. Let's get back to the idea of the whole right to vote and whether you should vote. I mean, what's your stance on that?
Well, I think let me say, first and foremost, I agree with what Paul and Dana both say, and that is, it would be better for us as a country if people voted their conscience and understood what they were voting for. That low information voting isn't necessarily good for the republic. But when it comes down to rights and what are absolute rights, if you're a citizen of this nation, you should have the right to vote, and obstacles placed in front of it are things that I have a hard time with. I think clearly as a nation we've made some really good strides in the past several years with more early voting. Clearly having an election day on a Tuesday when there are an awful lot of people at work and whatnot, it definitely can disenfranchise some people. So the development lately of early voting has helped alleviate some of those barriers. I also feel that states like Oregon and I believe Washington now, which conduct their vote completely by mail, I think that is another step in the right direction because it breaks down barriers. And I think when it comes to our rights as a citizenry, whether it's this right or our right to bear arms or anything like that, those rights should be unabridged, and we should have the ability to protect that, and that means also protecting people that don't take the responsibility or the responsibility and the privilege in a way that if they don't take it serious, that's a shame. But that's their right, and we should be protecting it.
Okay. Well, let me talk about some of those things that you brought up, like voting by mail, things like that. And I'm actually going to direct this next question at Danon, because Danon, you're probably all of us are very relatively technically savvy people, but Dana, you are really deep into technology, even more, I think, than Paul, even though Paul's a pretty big nerd too. But what do you think about internet voting? What do you think about going in that direction, Dana?
It's hard to say. I think I'd probably have to research the issue a little more in terms of maybe gathering arguments that others would make against it, because it feels like there should be some. On the surface, it strikes me as acceptable, but it just kind of intuition, I guess, it sort of tells me that there are reasons that don't occur to me to be a little more hesitant about such things. I know, to tie that to some of the things that Nick was saying, some of the absentee voting and such, I think, yeah, it breaks down barriers. It makes it easier for some people to vote, but it also makes it easier for some people to commit vote fraud. I would have the same concerns about internet voting, but at the same time, I generally dismiss people who have conspiracy theories about this candidate or that party has ties to the company that made the polling machines and this and that. I mean, there's a lot of checks in place. Both parties have representatives that check over these kinds of things. So I guess in terms of building in certain ways to tilt the vote one way or the other, that kind of thing doesn't concern me. But in ways of establishing identity or voting as a fake person, voting twice under different names, that kind of thing does concern me.
Okay, well, let's talk about that, because voter ID would play a part in an internet voting type situation or system. Because you think it would be easier or more difficult? Do you think we could come up with the controls necessary to make internet voting as secure or more secure even than, going to the poll or, by mail or whatnot?
Again, it's hard to say offhand without looking into the specifics of it, because offhand it would seem to me that, yeah, for the most part, we could secure it. So there's one person, one vote by social security number or this or that. The government mails you a postcard with your PIN on it, like you get for taxes and license plate renewals, that kind of thing. But on the other hand, I know there is a lot of fraud in income taxes, and there's a lot of fraud in payrolls. And people come up with fake social security numbers and so forth. I mean, there's a lot of fraud that's committed that I would otherwise think wouldn't be all that possible. And I don't know if it's from people turning a blind eye to it, or if it's actually easier than it would seem to me to be.
Okay. And Paul, what do you think about this particular topic? Internet voting, IDs, feasibility? I mean, the overall concept of IDs is obviously to try and authenticate people so that it is one person, one vote per citizen.
Well, the idea of internet voting kind of makes me a little queasy inside, because honestly, we can't handle some of the more important things when it deals with money today. And if we can't even watch our wallets as far as over the internet, who's gonna keep track of votes that meticulously? It makes me a little queasy, because of yeah, one vote, one person, but you've got to validate that. And how do you validate that the person that's standing in front of the computer at that particular time is the person that they say they are?
Well, how do they validate the people in Washington? I mean, they're sending in their votes via mail.
Signature.
Okay.
They have a signature card on each one.
All right.
So when you registered the vote, you had to sign something, and then they'll compare that signature against what was put in by mail.
That always strikes me as such a terrible way to validate somebody's identity. My dad, when I was a kid, used to go through checkout counters at grocery stores, and when you pay with a credit card, and you always know whenever the cashier kept his credit card while he was signing, that they were going to compare the signatures. And my dad would always sign completely different. He'd use an initial instead of the full name. He'd use totally different cursive on it. And invariably, the cashier would hold up the card, hold up the receipt, and say, okay, and then send him on his way. It's like, I don't know of anybody ever being called out on a signature, like, oh, the loops on your Ds are a little bit different size. It just doesn't strike me as a valid and consistent way to verify somebody's identity.
Well, that's exactly how. When at my precinct here in Deerfield, when I go to vote, that's exactly what they do. Is that I go there, they have me sign my voter card. They compare it to my registration signature, and that's what they look at when they give me my ballot here in Deerfield. So
yeah, mine too.
So whether it comes via mail or if it comes, it's not like they have a picture of me when I show up to vote.
Well, and that's another question. This is again coming back to the ID.
Do.
Well, and should they and should they compare? I mean, that this is kind of coming back to the standard voting methods and what we're talking about, voter ID. So, I mean, this is a question that you guys need to answer too, is what do you think about requiring a photo ID at the time of voting? Some of the states are for that. Some of the states are, think that's a freedom abridgment. I mean, what do you think, Paul?
Well, actually, as I was saying earlier, it makes me a little nervous. I'm a little conflicted on it because I do see the fact that there is the potential for fraud without it, but with it, it costs a whole lot of money, and frankly, it's money that we don't have as a country, as a state, there's very few states that are actually doing well right now. But in addition to that, we also have, the issues that it's abridging liberties. In small ways, yes, but it is still abridging liberties.
All right, and Nick, what do you think about that?
I guess I need a little clarification from Paul. What exactly are you saying is abridging liberties?
Requiring a card.
Yeah, requiring a card, I would agree. Because requiring a card will disenfranchise, disproportionately people that are poor because they tend not to go in to get a government ID. They don't have a car to drive, so they're not getting a driver's license. And it's not to say that it's not available to them. Understand that it's available to everybody, but it does tend to abridge the liberties of one group more than another.
All right, Danon.
You know what? Deal with it, man. So deal with it. There are a couple of things that are required of people to live in society, and one of them is to have an ID. That's just how it works. I never understood that argument because where it's been proposed, people have said, well, the poor don't have these, or well, black people don't have. I don't know the exact argument. I know Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton made that kind of argument that it's racist. So I say, okay, well, we'll send government officials to the home to give people government IDs. Oh, well, black people don't trust the man. These are all bogus arguments. I mean, get an ID. Who doesn't have an ID nowadays? I can't think of any good reason why you would oppose an ID for voting.
You're right about that. You're absolutely right about that. But that's not the liberties that it's abridging. I mean, it's the liberty that we have or should have to not have our property stolen from us without, not to have our property stolen, period.
What's being stolen?
Well, because they have to take money.
This is taxes argument.
Yeah, again, that's something where these voter ID laws are proposed. Then the advocates of the laws say, well, fine, we'll provide them to people for no money. It's not a poll tax.
No, you can't provide it for no money. That's not a possibility.
There's no such thing as a free lunch.
Right. Okay, so you're talking in terms of what it costs taxpayers and such. I guess I was specifically addressing the argument of charge of a poll tax, basically that the voter would have to pay for an ID.
Well, but I mean, I
Well,
guess
I think that's what Nick's argument is, but that's not my argument because frankly, but I don't think that holds any water at all. But what I do think holds water is the idea that in order to make each one of those cards, they have to steal money from each individual person in the state. And make no mistake, they're stealing from every single person in the state.
So my response is there are a few things that are that the government is to take care of. One is national defense. Another is polls, state IDs. That's something that I think generally the private sector doesn't take care of. I could see an argument where the private sector would step in, but
well, that's my argument against it entirely. I don't think the private sector should step in. I mean,
this is establishing an identity. This is something where I think the government has a legitimate stake.
And Paul, it's not as if these IDs are free. I mean, one of the suggested solutions, which Danon said, is to make them free, which would potentially make, I don't know if make Nick happy, but it would mean that there would be no supposed poll tax. But they're not free. We pay for them. I go to the DMV and I put down money, and then they give me a card. It's not like I go there and they go, here's your card, sir, because you're a citizen of the United States. That's not how it works. So, I mean, I understand that most of your arguments revolve around being stolen from by the man, but in this case, okay, maybe somewhat. I'm sure it's a subsidized cost, and maybe the equipment that they buy costs more than it would take for you to pay back over 10 years, and they buy a new one and subsidize it, whatever. But the point is, it's not a free piece of identification. It's something we pay for. And yes, in some ways we pay for it with taxes. I understand that, but that's not our debate here. The debate is not about the taxes.
Let's stay away from the tax piece.
Well, that's what it comes down to, really. I mean,
I know.
It's just such a minor point.
Everything comes down to that, Paul. But what I'm saying is, in this case, that's not what we're interested in discussing.
I don't believe that slave labor is a minor point.
Paul, I love you, man, but we need to keep this on track. We could spiral out of control, and I really like spiraling out of control a lot of times. But in this case, the idea is, do you think it's valid, ignoring where the costs come from? And yes, I'm asking you to do that for this one time. Do you think it's a valid exercise of the government to say, look, to validate you, to authenticate you, to reduce fraud significantly, is it valid to ask for an ID?
No, John.
No, go ahead, Nick.
Well, in order for us to understand, I mean, we have to understand what the actual occurrence of fraud is. I mean, we're talking about setting up the right kinds of controls, and I'll talk from my standpoint as a former auditor and current in the finance field. Internal controls are important. They help establish a certain trust in the system. So it is important to have some sort of way to verify that somebody is voting, and voting once, and voting in the district in which they live. I mean, I think that's clear. That's something that we need. The question then becomes is, what level of control do you need? Do you need to have a picture ID and the cost that's associated with it and whatnot to control fraud adequately? And if there is an absence of a control that has to do with a photo ID, for example, going back to what we talked about, comparing signatures and having a signature card, is that control good enough to provide people with a reasonable assurance that the outcomes of the election are based on people voting once, voting in their election? And that's the key. So that's what we have to come to an agreement as a community, as a society. What's the right level of controls around voting? Because what we don't want to have is a system where controls prohibit somebody who has the right to vote from voting. that's the worst possible outcome. It's the same way if I were to draw a parallel to our justice system, where we only convict people when we have something we have beyond a reasonable doubt, because what we want to do is we want to limit the number of innocent people that are convicted of a crime, because that outcome is far worse than having an outcome where there are criminals that get set free because we didn't meet the burden of proof. So I'll use that as a parallel. That's what we want. We want to have a system that provides adequate control, that it's not over the top, that you would have that worst outcome, which is I go to vote, I haven't voted yet, I go to my precinct, and they're telling me because I don't have a certain form of identification that I can't vote, and then my voice is taken away from me, and that right of voting should not be should not be taken away from me, and we should be doing everything in our power to protect that.
All right.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Dana.
I appreciate your point, and I might side with that argument if they were if anyone was proposing retinal scans or fingerprint scans. But right now we need a state-issued ID to write a check, to drive, to board an airplane, to use a credit card, to buy a gun, which is a constitutionally protected freedom, by the way, to fill a prescription, to start any service with utility, to buy cigarettes, walk into a bar to buy
you don't need an ID to buy a gun at a gun show, right? You can go to a gun show and not have an ID.
Is that the case? I'd claim ignorance on that.
Sure.
That would surprise me, though. But seriously, when I have to show my driver's license by clerk and D, I don't think it's overly burdensome to require a driver's license when you vote. You need a driver's license to attend the Democratic convention. And yet half of the delegates oppose voter IDs.
My only
I don't know half. I made up that statistic.
My only point, Dana, is we need to come to some sort of agreement on what constitutes the appropriate level of control. Because, again, the thing that I would want to avoid is somebody that has the right to vote being denied their right. And to me, it's more important to protect the person that is going in to vote, that that they not be denied their right, than it is for me to worry about Joe Blow voting twice. It's more. I actually
appreciate that.
Yeah,
your burden of guilt parallel. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
All right. Now, Paul, it's funny because being the I'm going to say libertarian, but we'll go classical liberal because I know you prefer that at least a little bit more than libertarian. I would think that you'd actually side with Nick on this, because it is maximizing your freedom to not have to supply additional information in order to vote, which is the right that that we are afforded by our country. So,
well articulated, by the way, John. I would agree with you in that's last sentiment. I would expect Paul to agree with me.
Right, but Paul, I don't think you necessarily do.
I would say that too.
Well, I recognize that there are issues with, frankly, we live right around the Chicago area. So, we know what goes on. I mean, it's pretty clear.
What went on?
Oh, all right. What went on? Sure. But the point is, there are issues there, and you can't clear them up simply. However, I'm not saying that I'm for an ID card, because frankly,
you don't want to pay for them. Just say it.
I can't say it. You guys just told me to say it.
All right.
You guys just told me I can't say what I believe. So there.
Well, okay. Let me try and frame it for you in a different light. And I understand your point, and I think everybody in the audience does too. These guys certainly do. But setting that
these
aside,
guys do, but I'm not sure that anybody in the audience does.
I think they do at this point. But setting that aside, what is your personal thoughts on just the simple freedom of being asked for an ID? Do you think that is putting an unreasonable burden on certain members of our society, whether it's a class-based segregation or something? Do you think that's the case, or do you think that it would be reasonable?
I don't really want to get into class,
Well, I don't want you to get into it. I'm asking for your opinion.
Can I try something here?
No.
That's-
Hold on, Nick. Hold on.
That's a pit that I just don't want to go into. And frankly, it does make me a bit queasy, as I said before, to think about the idea of a card. But the reality is, I know that there's issues. You're asking me for a solution. I don't know.
Well, no, I'm not asking you for a solution in this particular case. I'm asking for your opinion on whether you think that it is a reasonable request or not. That's all. Do you think it's reasonable or not to ask for an ID at the voting booth? That's it.
It's a tough question. I'm inclined to say yes in some ways, and I'm inclined to say no in others. Frankly.
Perfect. Explain.
Like I said, the issue is I know that there's fraud, and that's certainly one mark for it. However, I also know that it's another thing that stands in the way of a citizen of voting. And of doing something that's a guarantee in this country, and I don't like that. But I don't know. I can't say is it right or wrong. In my opinion, I can't answer that.
All right, let me throw out something, and Nick, I'm going to let you go. I think Paul's answered that much more completely than he might have 10 minutes ago. But Paul, if you were a politician, whatever kind of politician you want to be, and someone proposed that question to you and said, how would you vote if this came up as a vote? How would you vote?
No.
Okay. You'd vote against it on the measure of freedom, I assume.
Yeah.
Potential abridgment of freedom. Okay. All right, Nick, I'm curious where you wanted to go.
Mainly because of the tax issue, but that's another issue.
I know.
Well, see, this is what I was going to say. This is exactly what I was going to say. It's like, okay, let's get to Paul's utopian world. There's a very, very, very small central, federal government that only collects direct taxes, and they have enough room in the budget without going into a deficit that would allow them to provide an ID card for every citizen in the United States through direct taxation, without worrying about an income tax, indirect taxation, taking your property or anything like that. Would you then be for that said card?
I'm against direct taxation, just as our founding fathers were. However, no, I wouldn't be for it.
Okay, so your answer is the same based on freedom. Setting all else aside, you think that it would be...
Should I have said indirect taxation then?
You should have said indirect, yeah. But still, Paul's opinion stands. And I'm sorry, Paul.
That's what I meant then.
Yeah.
What form of taxation whatever taxation that Paul is okay with, if that could provide all of our budget dollars and not create a deficit.
Right.
Because I know there's a very narrow definition, and I'm sorry if I picked the wrong side of that one.
Well, see, it could provide all of our tax dollars, but we'd have to slim down the government just a little bit, like it used to be.
That's what I said. Have the smallest possible federal government that we could have. No, Department of Education, no Department of whatever, no Department of Taxation, all that good stuff. No IRS.
All right. And Dana, I'm gonna backtrack a little bit. Dana, did you find any examples that we were talking about earlier in the show?
Yeah, a couple. Actually, one recent, just to show I'm not crazy. I'm sure there are plenty more out there, but one of them actually is from this past week from...
well, these are incentives to vote, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Looks like it's from the local CBS affiliate out of Los Angeles. It says flyers offering $40 worth of free medical-grade marijuana were reportedly passed out in Eagle Rock to try to draw residents to vote in the local election. I suppose I don't have to comment on who I think, which party I think would be served by that. And another one's from about a year ago, September 2011, out of Wisconsin. I believe this was around the time of the recall election and some of that other stuff, which says there was an investigation into an anti-abortion group, the Wisconsin Right to Life, as well as the Service Employees International Union. Their organization, Wisconsin Jobs Now, both have allegations against them of vote bribery. So I don't know the exact. Oh, here, as an added incentive, the volunteer who had the most absentee applications received a $75 gas card. So it looks like that's incentives for people to go out and get a bunch of people to submit absentee ballots and so forth.
That's sort of an odd way of doing it, but.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
what about wasn't it the Koch brothers that said if you vote for Obama and he gets elected, you're going to get fired or something like that? I mean, what's the flip side to that, right? Is that there are other ways to influence people's vote, and it's not necessarily voting on
Yeah.
on the merits of the candidates, right? We want.
I guess
It's actually taken out of context a little bit, Nick.
Well, I'm just saying. I mean, ultimately, what I'm trying to say is, we would love it if everybody voted on the merits of the candidates, right? The merits of their arguments and the way they would govern, and whether or not you believe in the way that they govern, right? That's what we're looking for.
Sure.
So
Yeah,
the question then becomes.
I mean, there's a difference between changing somebody's ideas and opinions on how they may be personally affected or how their family or community would be affected by a candidate's policies, or offering them marijuana or a gas card.
No, yeah.
In terms of direct bribery, I guess. I don't know.
Well, but it's not like you can control their hand once they get in the booth, and it's not like anybody knows what they've really voted.
That's exactly right. It's probably the most unprovable thing about whether or not the guy could go in and vote for the other guy and still get the pot, right?
Yeah. I mean, you're playing the numbers, I guess.
Yeah.
So, but I think a lot of these tend to target demographics that would vote for one side or the other. I would think.
Well, now let's talk about numbers for a second. I know we don't have anything at all on this, and Nick, this kind of just goes to you as a previous auditor. What do you think the margin of error is? What do you think the fraud level would need to get to for us to really, as a country, need to spend some actual time on this? I mean, I'm assuming right now that the fraud level is pretty low, and I don't have anything specific. I don't know the numbers, but.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that and let's also be clear, and I kind of mentioned this in my opening, is there's something very different between actual voter fraud and voter registration fraud, right? There's two different steps here. It's one thing to register yourself fraudulently, and we see a lot of voter registration fraud because there are people that are paid to sign people up, and that's when they start to put Charlie Brown on the voter list, and they start putting in fictitious names and IDs into the voter rolls because hey, I'm trying to work this job, and for every 100 people I sign up, I get $100 bonus or something like that, right? So that's voter registration fraud. And the likelihood if I'm that person and I'm committing that fraud where I'm signing up a whole bunch of people to fictitiously vote, that would fictitiously kind of vote, the likelihood that votes would ever be cast for those identifications is extremely low, because the reason for committing that fraud wasn't so that I can change the outcome of the election, it was so I could put some money in my pocket. The second thing is actual voter fraud. That means I voted somewhere, I'm going to go to the next precinct over, and I'm going to vote again because I have a legitimate ID or an illegitimate ID, but I have something there that would allow me to get a ballot and cast a vote. And so from that standpoint, you can't equate one with the other, and I would say that there's probably a heck of a lot more voter registration fraud than there is actual voter fraud. So with that as a backdrop, John, to answer your question, when you start to see 1% of the votes cast as illegitimate as actual vote fraud, I think that's a significant problem. Now, there aren't a ton of races that are decided by 1 percentage point, but there are some. And the moment you start, flipping elections because of vote fraud, that's a problem, and we should have the controls around it to make sure that that doesn't happen.
And that's where we get back to our question, and it's a question for the viewers too.
And what I guess what I want to end with is there is going to be no system that's perfect. I mean, again, I'll go back to my analogy of how our justice system works right now. There are innocent people that go to jail. We want it to be very rare, but clearly it happens. It just doesn't happen a lot. And so the burden of proof, being what it is,
we hope not.
Yeah, I'm just saying, the number of cases that people are freed, using like DNA evidence and all that kind of stuff where that's appropriate. I mean, thank God it's rare. You don't hear a lot of it, but you do hear it, and every time you hear it, it's like that just it makes me sick to my stomach to think that somebody did hard time for something that they shouldn't have done, that they didn't do. That sucks. But no system's perfect, and so if the ideal is that we're going to have a voter system here that prevents every single, there's no illegitimate votes whatsoever, then you're going to have a system that's going to prevent too many legitimate people from voting, and that's not acceptable. So you have to find the balance.
I don't think it would even be possible at that point.
Why's that, Paul?
Well, I mean, to have absolutely no votes cast that are not supposed to be cast. I mean, you'd have to put an awful lot of restrictions, and I don't think that even at that point you would have a perfect record.
Right. Not with the hundreds of millions of votes that are cast.
Yeah.
Right.
Or 100 million or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Just playing the numbers.
Let me end with this, guys, just for fun.
And by the way, I think you should be able to sell your vote. Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. Well, that's a nice topic. Bomb to leave at the end there, Paul. All right, but let me throw this at you guys. Let me throw this at you guys because this is going to inspire a tiny bit of conversation. I just want to allow like 30 seconds each to answer this, and then we'll call it a night. What do you think about DNA-based voting? You don't need an ID. You are your ID. Somebody takes a little sample when you get to the booth. It's compared to the one that you got on your birth certificate or whatever it is, wherever your DNA code is stored in the master database in the 1984 computer or whatever. What do you think about that? And I'm going to end with Nick, and I'm going to start with Dana on this one.
Is the technology there for that? I don't know that it is.
Let's just say that it is. Let's just say
okay, we're speaking theoretically.
Right.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to the 1984 analogies and such. That's a hard one. I don't know. I understand people say, well, we don't want to keep a federal database of DNA records and this and that. If there were to be such a thing, I would be a full proponent of keeping it completely separate from all other kind of government records and having lots of checks and outside verifications that it's completely kept separate from the IRS and the FBI and all of that, and it's only used for purposes of voting. I also know there'd be a whole lot of people who would never believe that would be the case, and I guess I can appreciate an argument that would disenfranchise voters, that it's sort of an invasion of privacy in a sense. I know that's not really an answer. I don't know, man. That's hard.
Okay, well, I understand that you like considering everybody else's thoughts, but what's yours? What would you be for or against it, straight up?
That's what I'm saying. I don't know. It's stuff I'd have to give it some thought, and I guess it would just come down to the details. I guess if I had reasonable assurances that it was completely limited to voter registration, and I was satisfied with the safeguards to ensure that, I guess I would consider voting yes.
Okay.
Especially if all other forms of identification have failed, if we can't establish that you need your driver's license or whatever else.
Well, this way it prevents any issues with needing a card. You are your card. I mean,
yeah.
I'm not saying I'm for it. I'm just throwing out a theoretical.
Appreciate it on the surface, but it's a tough one. I guess I'd have to think about it.
Yeah, and granted, I jaded it by giving the 1984 reference, but that's okay.
No, I think that's natural. I think that immediately would come to everybody's mind anyway.
Right. All right.
I would think.
All right, Paul, how about you?
Now, this is something I can sink my teeth into. Yes.
I know.
Nah, I'm messing with you. Of course, yeah, that's way over the top. That's insane.
Why is that?
Well, it's insane because you know, we're asking people to give their DNA in order to vote. We're asking them to give over their DNA to the state. That's insane.
Paul's about to explode.
Nuts.
All right, how about this? How about this for you, Paul? You like encryption, right? So let's say instead of you getting your DNA stored, there is a what do you call it when you take something and you encrypt it so it's not reversible anymore? What do you call that?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Encryption?
Yes.
Well,
Where you
but like,
like the MD5 checks.
well, yeah, I don't
Sure.
need the technical term, but like a one-way encryption.
Yeah.
So you take your
Yeah.
DNA, do some sort of formula on it, come up with a unique number, that number's stored. They don't have your DNA, they just have this code that if you run the same formula on your DNA in the future, you'll get the same code, plus or minus whatever the differences are.
Couldn't they just
Yeah,
reverse
again,
engineer it?
you're giving the state your DNA.
No, because Nick, non-reversible encryption, basically, it breaks. It breaks.
I don't know. I'm a math guy. It just tells me if you have you have an equation, that means there's two sides to it, right?
Well, that's
No, there are
There are
ways,
ways
to
to do
encrypt things like this.
yeah. This is why I'm appealing to the two computer guys here because I know what I'm talking about.
There are ways to do it, but the problem is you have to encrypt it the first time.
Right.
You have to give the state your DNA
Well,
to
okay, so
encrypt it the first time.
No, I mean, we can outsource that to private industry.
exactly. I was going to say, let's go down the private road, Paul, and have it outsourced so that they just have to
Somebody's gonna
provide the
store it
number.
somewhere.
No, we're still talking Big Brother here. That's
All right.
just craziness.
I tried, but all right, Nick, I'm
What
going
about iris scan or fingerprint or something like
Well, I mean, again, those things, again, unless it's stored as some sort of a one-way encryption, which it could be,
Yeah.
and in that case, you're not giving something up. You're just identifying yourself. But I'll save that. It's a good enough argument with the DNA. We'll stick with that to end it, because otherwise we'll be here forever. Nick, what are your thoughts on that idea?
I would vote no against it. There's just too much of a opportunity for abusing it for other reasons. So
Okay.
I think it puts up too much of a barrier.
Well, I
that.
mean,
That's where I was torn, though, is that I would be inclined to agree with that, but I can't really think of many other reasons that it would be abused. I mean, cloning comes to mind, but
Yeah, that's the sole reason for me, is that it would get abused, and there's really no way to guarantee it wouldn't.
well,
wait,
again,
wait a minute. if
I have
it
a
doesn't
fundamental
get
right to
abused-
privacy. Yeah.
Exactly.
right. But I guess I'm speaking from a pragmatic sense. Say I'm a supervillain who got elected to the government, to the presidency, or appointed to head of the FBI or CIA, and I have this big database of DNA on mine. What am I going to do with it? What would you do with it?
Paul.
It doesn't
What
matter.
would you do with the DNA? I mean, I understand on the surface it's kind of terrifying and disconcerting, but
He would figure out a way to
what's gonna
reprogram
happen?
people to be classic liberals.
I mean, clone an army of
I
super
could go for that.
classic liberal soldiers, or
All right, guys. I think we've beaten this dead horse pretty dead, and I appreciate all of your different takes on it. And you in the audience, I mean, this is an interesting question for you. And if you know what non-reversible encryption is, you know where I'm going with that. But anyway, I'm just curious about what your thoughts are in the audience. If you guys want to, post some remarks and comments on what you think, how that would work, or if you have a better 1984 scenario than that. But again,
if you could tell me what you would do with a database of DNA.
exactly. Or if you were a supervillain, what would you do with a database of DNA?
Or
Or if you
superhero.
can tell me, or if you can tell me how to clone an army of classical liberals.
All right,
By the way,
guys.
Paul, I hope you enjoyed my my updated lower third.
Yeah, I saw that.
All right, guys. Thanks for your time, and to the audience, thanks for watching. Have a good night.